Hello, listeners, from Roy Demarie in Sam, speaking over a weekend when it's difficult to be very cheerful because so many things seem to be going wrong at once. It's very tragic, this falling out with Russia. There is indeed little choice but to take action against a country and a leader who denies something when the data are so clear that there's responsibility on his part almost personally. And I regret that greatly. And I hope he might learn. He would never admit he can learn anything, but he might learn that actually trying to poison people in another country with a product which is made only in Russia is just not on. So I would hope and pray that lessons be learned on both sides. Putin will never, ever admit to learning a lesson from the West, but he might secretly realize he's taken a step too far and relations can be rebuilt with mutual respect, if not really strong friendship. Now, last week I spoke about the economics behind trade deficits and the complete illogicality of the Trump move to impose tariffs on steel and aluminium. And the illogicality of that is found in almost every analysis of the situation, except for this fellow who's just won a Philadelphia election, where I think for political reasons he said, yes, I support the tariffs. He probably doesn't at all. But to say he does would obviously win him some votes in a steel-making town. Now, the FT has done quite a serious analysis of how best to respond. The way they put it is that the aluminium and steel exporting countries are grappling with one of the most intractable puzzles in trade policy, namely, how do you deal with a fundamentally illogical hegemon? So there we are. If they respond in the natural way, which would be tariffs against American goods, we could be at the beginning of a long and damaging trade war. And I see a lot of parallel between this and dealing with Russia. Dealing with Trump is like dealing with Russia. There's an illogicality there, which means that normal, rational argument, is there a motive for doing this, why and what and so on, it doesn't really apply because you're dealing with irrational people, at least in terms of Western logic. What sort of logic with Trump is there behind him saying we're going to use the national security exemption in WTO rules to impose these tariffs? I mean, there is no security stake at all, but he says there is, and so it's a way of fiddling the system. There are serious doubts that Trump could be defeated in some operation via the WTO dispute system. And if the US won on this and the EU, for example, lose, that would hand Trump a propaganda victory. And the key concept here is bypassing. If the United States under Trump wants to step out of the international global trading system, then maybe one can do without America altogether. And there is already an example. There are 11 economies in the Trans-Pacific Partnership who decided that after Trump pulled out of the arrangements, they would somehow encourage multilateral trading system and might even set up the possibility of settling their own dispute under the aegis of WTO rules. Now, none of this is easy, not least because an effective effort to isolate the USA needs to include China, which has also been shifting away from an open rules-based approach to trade. Well, I find this whole issue of Trump's behavior in imposing tariffs, as well as Putin's behavior in causing the death of agents, extremely depressing. But there's even more reason to be depressed after I visited a bank this week to actually open an account which couldn't be opened, but it doesn't matter. What I learned in my discussion was that even Swiss-based companies dealing only with Switzerland or Europe, everything is now totally transparent to the United States authorities. Now, I'm not too happy about that. Why should one country be able to exert such hegemony over the whole world, including Switzerland, which has always been so discreet with itself? I don't think this can really last. I don't think it is acceptable for sovereign countries to be subject to surveillance by the United States or any other big country for that matter. It has affected me in a business recently, not a bank, which the Americans determined was not satisfactory, has had to close down. Actually, it was in Riga, if you're interested. And it seems that it is indeed, Americans can go around closing European banks. Amazing. And of course, whenever we talk about tax avoidance and those things, we find that the biggest culprit is the United States with its, typically we say Delaware companies, although it's by no means limited to Delaware. I may or may not be able to go to the United States with a visa in the future if the CIA take umbrage to my comments on this broadcast, but I actually think we need to take steps as sovereign nations outside the USA to stop the USA running us. We want to run ourselves. There's such a concept as sovereignty. And I apologize to any Americans listening who think that I'm going a bit too far, but I don't think I am. Mark well my words, this cannot go on like this, having one country, as it were, bullying the rest of the world. My personal sympathies go to Rex Tillerson. Like him or not, that doesn't matter, but to be fired by a tweet without explanation is not really proper civilized behavior. It is quite fascinating to watch the US political scene in the sense of voting and that sort of thing, because the Pennsylvania victory of Lamb is quite a turnaround, and it must really frighten the Republican parties. And one wonders to what extent the irrational firing of people and so on by tweet yet will eventually turn the party against their own president. I say all that without wanting to interfere or comment politically. Just observe what's happening in the USA and see if the system is robust enough to handle this very difficult situation for them. Now, let me end today's chat by talking about where to invest. I've already come up with the idea, based, I will admit, on my guru, Harry Dent, that although the long-term rates, 10-year rates on US Treasuries has gone to a new level, it really can't go much higher because the economy is nothing like doing as well as they are pretending. The stock market has reached a plateau and probably will be going down. You know that Dent thinks it's going to collapse. I don't go that far, but I think it is not a place to earn decent money anymore. And he recommends, and I would endorse that there is a case for putting some of our savings into bonds, because this ever-increasing idea of bond interest rates is actually not going to happen, given the deflation and the slowness of the American economy recovery. And remember always that this huge deficit internally, which has been exacerbated by the tax cuts, that has repercussions on international trade, which have to be recognized in macroeconomic terms, even if there is a refusal to accept that on the part of the White House and its team. Although a team member did realize it, and of course he's had to leave, this gentleman called Cohn. Another idea which is emerging now is that if the US stock market is not very interesting, and the European stock market also not very interesting, where does one go? Well, actually, part of the answer I'm consistent with is that I think it's always good to have in one's portfolio, either directly or via ETFs, good, solid Swiss global company stocks. But beyond that, if you want to take more of a gamble, and you can do that with a small proportion of your portfolio, the idea now is to try and pick up or benefit from the expanding Asian economies. And don't just think in terms of China, when we're talking about Asia. How do you invest in Asia? Well, the answer can't be that you go out and pick stocks. We just don't know enough about Asia and the companies there to do that. But you can do it via exchange-traded funds. This beast, which has risen up almost from nowhere in recent years, and has proven very popular. If you see your banker or your broker, probably the banker because brokers aren't too interested in them, you can find ETFs which will reflect investment in Asia, maybe non-China or non-Japan Asia, but whatever it is, it would be a way of benefiting from the expected rise of Asia in the world economy. Now, next week I'm going to Zurich, and exceptionally, within Robert Kennedy College, I'm going to spend a couple of days actually in situ teaching. Normally I do most of my work online. And next week there are two big topics which I'm going to be tackling. One is the idea of the added value and where it happens in a company, in a business activity. And the other is how do you deal with some disruptive event in a market, of which the great example in recent years has been the arrival of the low-cost airlines, and how companies like Lufthansa, we have a case on them, take care of it. I think after those 2 days I will learn a lot teaching and receiving from the students, and I might use some of that material to give you a little talk next week. Till then, I just hope that we don't have a global trade war.